The night Vivian Sterling threw the keys was the coldest night of the year. Snow came down in sheets, thick and relentless, swallowing the city whole. The streetlights outside the Harrington Grand Hotel had turned the falling snow a pale amber color, and every few minutes a gust of wind would drive it sideways into the face of whoever was unlucky enough to be standing outside. Ethan Cole was always unlucky enough to be standing outside. He was 38 years old, a single father working the overnight security shift at the hotel, and he had learned long ago that luck was not something that visited men like him. He stood at his post near the main entrance with his collar turned up against the wind, his old coat buttoned to the throat patches of darker fabric visible at both elbows where he had mended it himself with thread that didn't quite match. It was a good coat once. That was a long time ago. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and watched the snow settle on the sidewalk and thought about Lily. Lily was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes, dark and curious and quick to find the light in things, and she had her father's stubbornness, which meant she never once complained about the cold apartment or the thin blankets or the way the heat sometimes cut out in the middle of the night. Their building on Caldwell Street was the kind of place where the landlord answered maintenance calls in weeks rather than days, and the radiators knocked and groaned like old men climbing stairs. The heating bill had gone up 40% since October. Ethan had done the math 3 different times, hoping he had made an error somewhere, but the numbers always came out the same. He was falling behind. Not by catastrophic amounts, not yet, but the gap between what he earned and what he owed was widening in the way rivers widen slowly at first, then all at once. Lily had asthma. The prescription had run out the previous Tuesday, and the refill cost more than he had in his account. So he had been watching her carefully, checking the rise and fall of her small chest while she slept, counting each breath as if counting could keep them coming. She never said anything about it. She was braver than any person had a right to be at 8 years old. He had been a mechanic for 11 years before the accident. That wasn't really an accident, a cascade of small decisions made by tired people in a factory that resulted in a machine malfunction that broke 2 fingers on his left hand and ended his ability to work with the precision that engine work required. The settlement was modest. The transition to security work was practical. He told himself it was temporary, and then stopped telling himself that because the temporary had lasted 4 years and Lily had grown 2 inches and lost 4 teeth and learned to read chapter books, and the permanent had a way of arriving quietly while you were watching for something else. He was not an unhappy man. That was important to understand. He loved his daughter with the complete organizing love of someone for whom love has become the central fact of existence. He cooked dinner most nights and helped with homework and read to her on the nights she wanted it and sat in the dark on the nights she didn't close enough that she knew he was there. He was not an unhappy man, but he was tired in the specific way of people who carry more than their share for longer than they expected, and the tiredness had begun to show in his face in ways he noticed in mirrors and chose not to think about too closely. The convoy arrived at 11:47. 3 black SUVs, long and gleaming, cutting through the snow like dark ships. They pulled up to the entrance, and the doors opened, and people in expensive coats began moving quickly into the lobby, the way people who are accustomed to hotels move without looking around, without hesitation, as if every space they entered had been arranged for their specific benefit. Ethan stepped aside. He was good at that. Vivian Sterling came last. She was tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than 3 months of his rent. Her dark hair pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested either a very good stylist or a very controlled personality. She was 36 years old and the chief executive of Sterling Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing electric vehicle companies in the country. And she moved through the world with the particular coldness of someone who had decided very early on that warmth was a liability. She glanced at Ethan as she passed, and the glance contained nothing. Not contempt, not acknowledgement. He simply did not register. He had been looked through enough times to recognize the difference, and this was the latter. He held the door. She walked past. The snow kept falling. He heard about the deal later that night from Marcus, the front desk manager, who always had too much information and too little discretion. Vivian Sterling had been in Chicago for a major acquisition, a smaller EV battery startup that was supposed to be the centerpiece of Sterling Dynamics' next phase of expansion. The deal had collapsed at the table. Details were unclear, but the numbers involved were in the hundreds of millions, and the blame, according to Marcus, was still being distributed among parties who each believed it belonged to someone else. What was clear was that Vivian Sterling had flown back to Chicago in a mood that the hotel staff had begun quietly preparing for the way coastal residents prepare for hurricane season with a specific, practiced dread. Ethan filed this away and said nothing and went back to his rounds. It was near the end of his shift, around 4 in the morning, when she found him. He was doing a sweep of the underground parking structure, a long, cold loop he made twice a night, checking the cameras in the corners and the cars sleeping in their stalls. He heard her heels before he saw her, a sharp sound on the concrete that didn't belong to the hour. She came around the corner with her coat still on and a set of keys in her hand, and she stopped when she saw him and seemed to decide something. "You," she said, "the security man?" He said yes. She walked past him to a far corner of the garage to a stall he had assumed was simply empty because he had never seen anyone use it, and she pointed her key fob at the darkness and nothing happened. She clicked it again. Still nothing. She lowered her arm and stood there for a moment, and that was when he saw the car. It was covered in a decade of dust and neglect. He could make out the shape of it, a low, long coupe, old enough to have been built when American cars were still built for drama, for presence, for the idea that driving was an event rather than a transaction. The body was buried under a canvas tarp that had slipped halfway off one side, and where the metal was visible, it was dull and flecked with rust along the lower panels. The tires were flat. The windshield had a crack running from the lower left corner toward the center. It looked like a vehicle that had given up. Vivian stared at it with an expression that he couldn't quite read. Not sadness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had hardened over time into something else entirely. She turned to him. "Get rid of it," she said. "However you want. Scrap it, sell it, I don't care." She held out the keys. He didn't move immediately. She pressed them into his hand. "It's registered in my name," she said. "I'll have the paperwork sent down. It isn't worth fixing." She turned to leave. He looked down at the keys and then back at the car. "Can I ask what make it is?" She paused without turning around. "Something my father loved more than good sense," she said. "Crest Automotive, 1964, custom prototype," which is a fancy way of saying one of a kind and completely useless. She kept walking. Her heels faded into the concrete dark. Ethan stood alone with the keys in his hand and the car in front of him and the snow still falling somewhere far above. He drove it home before sunrise, which was more than he expected to be able to do. The engine turned over on the 5th attempt, coughing and gasping, before settling into a rough idle that smoothed out slightly as the temperature climbed. He drove slowly, the headlights cutting weak yellow paths through the empty streets. The car smelled like old leather and something else beneath it, something faint and particular that he couldn't name. He parked in the spot behind his building and sat there for a moment after he cut the engine, listening to it tick as it cooled. He went upstairs and slept 3 hours, and then Lily was shaking his shoulder. She had found it from the window. She was already in her coat and boots by the time he was fully awake, standing at the apartment door with enormous eyes and her breath making small clouds in the cold air because the radiator had gone out again sometime in the night. "Is it ours?" she said. "For now," he said. She bolted for the stairs. He followed more slowly, pulling on his jacket, watching her run across the frozen lot toward the car and press her face against the passenger window, and then step back and circle it slowly, the way she circled things she was deciding whether to love. "It's very old," she said. "Yes." "Is it broken?" "Mostly." She pressed her hand flat against the hood and looked at him over the roof with a seriousness that was almost comic on a face that small. "We should fix it," she said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that costs something. "Maybe?" he said. He looked more carefully that afternoon. Standing in the pale winter light with a flashlight and a rag, he wiped away years of grime and studied what was underneath. The body was worse than it had appeared in the dark surface rust along the rocker panels, a dent above the rear wheel well, a section of chrome trim that had come loose on one side and hung at an angle like a broken wing. But the bones were there. He could see it. The proportions were right, the stance low and confident, even on 4 flat tires, the lines clean in the way that only handmade things are clean. He found the badge on the nose, a small enamel crest, deep red with a silver border, and crouched to look at it. It was not a mass-produced badge. The enamel work was too fine, too deliberate. He turned the flashlight on it from different angles. He had worked around cars his whole life in one form or another, had spent his 20s as a mechanic before circumstances redirected him toward security and away from everything else, and he knew enough to know this was not the product of a factory line. Someone had made this by hand. He stood up and looked at the car for a long moment. Then he heard the door open behind him. Walter Grimes lived in Unit 4, directly below Ethan's apartment. He was 71 years old, a retired automotive restoration specialist who had spent 40 years bringing dead cars back to life. And he moved slowly now on account of his hip, but his eyes were still the sharpest thing about him. He came out into the lot in his heavy robe and his worn-down slippers carrying his coffee, and he stopped when he saw the car. He stopped so completely, so suddenly, that Ethan turned to look at him. The old man's face had gone pale. He said nothing for a moment. He walked closer slowly, with the reverence of a man approaching something he thought he would never see, and he put his hand on the hood and stood there with his eyes moving over every line of the car in the careful, practiced way of someone reading a language they have spent their life learning. Then he looked at Ethan and said, "Where did you get this?" It was not a question. It came out flat and absolute with the weight of decades behind it, Ethan explained. Walter listened without interrupting, without moving, until Ethan finished. Then the old man said, "Do you know what this is?" Ethan said he wasn't sure. Walter set his coffee down on the roof of a nearby car and wiped his hands on his robe and crouched carefully beside the driver's door, lowering himself with the slow, deliberate caution of a man who has learned the cost of rushing. He pointed to a small stamped plate visible through the window on the door jamb. "Read that number to me," he said. Ethan leaned in close and read the number. Walter closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he said, "In 1964, Crest Automotive produced 3 custom prototype coupes. They were never sold. They were engineering studies built by hand, each one slightly different, meant to test new chassis geometry before the company was absorbed by a larger manufacturer. One burned in a warehouse fire in 1967. One ended up in a private collection in Europe and has not been seen in 30 years. The third one was reported missing in 1978. He stood back up carefully. He looked at the car. "This is the third one," he said. Ethan looked at the old man. He looked at the car. He looked back at the old man. "You're certain?" he said. Walter picked up his coffee from the neighboring car's roof. "I've been looking at cars for 50 years, he said. "I'm not certain about most things anymore. My hip, my memory for names, whether the coffee at the diner on Mercer has gotten worse, or I have simply lived long enough to know what good coffee tastes like. But this," he gestured at the car with his mug, "this I am certain about. The proportions are exactly as described in the technical documents I read when I was 24 years old and new to this work. The badge is hand-formed, not stamped by a machine. The number on that plate matches a partial registry I have in a file in my apartment that I have been keeping since 1981 because I am the kind of man who keeps files like that." He sipped his coffee. "This is the car." The two of them stood in the cold parking lot behind the building on Caldwell Street and looked at the rusted coupe in the pale morning light, and neither of them said anything for a while. The snow had stopped. The sky was the color of old paper. Somewhere nearby a pigeon was moving along a ledge, and the small sounds it made were the only sounds in the world. Ethan spent the next 6 hours at his kitchen table with his laptop following threads. Walter sat across from him with his own coffee and occasionally said a number or a name or a date that pointed Ethan toward the next document. There were auction records, specialty publication archives, a 40-year-old article in an automotive magazine that described the 3 prototypes in technical detail and noted that the missing third example had last been registered to a private collector in Illinois. There were collector forums where people had speculated for years about whether it still existed. There was a post from 8 years ago in a thread about the great lost cars of the 20th century, where someone had estimated that a verified example of the Crest 64 prototype in restorable condition would be worth somewhere in excess of $5 million. Ethan read that line 3 times. Walter watched him read it. The question, Walter said, is whether it's real, which means it needs to be verified, which means a specialist and documentation and time. Ethan sat back. He thought about Lily's prescription. He thought about $200,000, which was a figure that felt impossible, and $5 million, which felt like something from another universe entirely. "What do I do?" he said. Walter wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out the kitchen window at the car parked below. "You find out the truth first," he said. "Everything else comes after that." Lily was in the living room doing her homework when Ethan brought her the mug of chamomile tea she always had before bed. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her books spread around her and her pencil behind her ear, and when she looked up at him she had that expression she sometimes got attentive and a little too old for her face, as if she could sense that something significant had happened and was waiting politely for him to explain it. He sat down beside her. He told her about what Walter had said, simplified, somewhat edited for age appropriateness. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe Mom sent it." He looked at her. She was looking at her homework. "She always said things show up when you need them," Lily said. "She used to say that all the time, remember?" He did remember. He remembered a great many things about her mother that he kept to himself most of the time, because it was the only way he had found to keep moving forward. He said, "Maybe she did." Lily nodded satisfied and went back to her homework. He sat with her for a while in the quiet. He found the hidden compartment the following morning. He had been methodically cleaning the interior, removing years of accumulated grime from every surface when he pressed against the base of the driver's seat and felt something give in a way that the rest of the seat did not. He pressed again. There was a faint mechanical click, and a panel in the base of the seat, perhaps 6 inches wide and 4 deep, separated slightly from the surrounding material. He worked his fingers into the gap and lifted. Inside, sealed in what turned out to be a surprisingly effective envelope of old waxed cotton, there was a composition notebook with a cracked cover, a small photograph, and several folded pages of what appeared to be technical drawings. His hands were very still for a moment. Then he lifted the notebook carefully, the way you lift something you are not sure you have the right to touch, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and neat and dense, the handwriting of someone who thought in organized systems, and at the top of the first page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, property of Raymond Sterling. The notebook changed everything and nothing. It changed what Ethan understood about the car and the woman who had discarded it. It changed nothing about the math of his life, not yet, but it added a dimension he hadn't expected, a human one, complicated and sad, in the particular way that stories about fathers and daughters are always sad. Raymond Sterling had been, according to the notebook and to the additional research Ethan did, in the 2 days that followed, a genuinely gifted automotive engineer who had designed the 64 Crest prototype largely alone, working nights and weekends on his own time while employed by the larger company that had acquired Crest. He had believed in what he was building the way people believe in things when they are young enough to think belief is sufficient. He had filed for patents. He had been outmaneuvered by people with lawyers he couldn't afford and connections he didn't have. The designs had been absorbed. The patents had been contested. By 1972, Raymond Sterling was working a factory floor job in a city he had moved to out of necessity, and his daughter Vivian, who'd been born into his early optimistic years, had grown up watching her father's genius be converted into bitterness and ruin. The photograph was of a young girl, maybe 6 years old, standing in front of the car when it still gleamed, squinting into the sun, one hand on the door handle. Vivian. Ethan looked at the photograph for a long time. Walter read the notebook and said very little afterward, which was more telling than anything he might have said. The man appeared at Ethan's door on a Wednesday evening 4 days after the car had come into his possession. He was well dressed in a way that communicated money without announcing it, and he carried a card that identified him as representing a private collector. He was very polite. He said his employer had heard there might be a 1964 Crest prototype in the area and was interested in discussing acquisition. He offered $200,000, cash, available within 48 hours. Ethan stood in his doorway and looked at this man and thought about Lily's prescription. He thought about the back rent. He thought about the heating bill and the way the radiator knocked and the way his coat had a third patch now that didn't match the other two. $200,000. It was real money. It was life-changing money. It was, if he was honest, more money than he had ever expected to hold in any form at any point in his life. He said he would think about it. The man gave him a card and left. Ethan sat with it all night. He almost called Walter, but decided against it. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark long after Lily was asleep and turned the man's card over and over in his hands. Before midnight, Walter knocked. Ethan let him in. The old man sat down across from him without being invited and put his hands on the table and said, "Someone offered you money." It was not a question. Ethan said yes. Walter said, "How much?" Ethan told him. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Think about it this way. A man in a good suit drives to your address and offers $200,000 in cash within 48 hours for something he has been told is an old car of uncertain provenance. Why does he do that?" Ethan said nothing. "Because he knows what it is," Walter said. "And if he knows it's worth 200,000, he knows it's worth far more than 200,000. He's offering you the smallest number he thinks you'll take." He leaned back. "The question isn't whether to sell. The question is what it's actually worth." Ethan looked at the card. He set it on the table face down. Later that night, when he went to check on Lily, she was awake. She looked at him in the low light and said, "Are you going to sell the car?" He said he didn't know yet. She said, "Mom always said don't take the first offer." He went back to the kitchen and sat down and didn't sleep. He found the signature the next morning. He had been examining the engine, a task Walter was helping with, pointing out what was original and what had been modified at some later date, when Walter leaned in with a flashlight and said very quietly, "Come look at this." Ethan looked. On the interface of the valve cover, stamped into the metal with what appeared to be a hand tool, were 2 words and a year. Raymond Sterling, 1964. He stood back up and put his hands in his pockets and looked at the sky. The snow had stopped the day before. The air was very cold and very still. He made his decision. What happened next moved quickly. Walter made calls to people he had known for decades, specialists and authenticators and collectors who knew how to keep information quiet until it was ready to be made loud. A verification process was set in motion. Documentation, forensic dating of materials chassis number, validation against registry records that had been maintained by a small nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of American automotive history. 2 men flew in from out of state. They spent an afternoon with flashlights and reference photographs and measurement tools, speaking in the low technical language of their field, occasionally glancing at Walter as if seeking confirmation, occasionally glancing at Ethan as if trying to understand how he fit into this picture. Ethan stayed out of their way. He made sandwiches that no one ate and coffee that both of them drank, and he took Lily to the park for an hour while the examination continued. And when he came back, the 2 men were standing outside with their coats on, and one of them looked at him with an expression that contained a great deal of information compressed into a very small space. "It's real," the man said. "Just that. The results came back in 5 days, fully documented. The car was authentic. It was as Walter had said, standing in a parking lot in his robe and worn-down slippers, the missing 3rd prototype. An auction house with offices in New York and London was contacted. A date was set. Word traveled the way word travels in closed communities, carefully at first, then not carefully at all. Vivian Sterling found out on a Thursday. She was in a board meeting when her assistant slid a note across the table to her, and she read it twice before her face changed, and then she excused herself from the meeting and stood in the corridor for a long moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall. The car, the one she had given away without ceremony, dropped into the hands of a security guard as if disposing of evidence. She made calls. She learned what had been learned about it. She learned about the auction. Her legal team was consulted. Options were discussed. Her PR advisor expressed concern about how any aggressive action might appear in light of the story already taking shape in specialty publications and collector forums. Vivian sat in her office on the 43rd floor with the city spread out below her and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The particular sensation of having made an error that could not be immediately corrected by throwing resources at it. She went to see Ethan. She found him at his apartment on a Friday evening, and he answered the door in his patched coat, even though he was indoors because the heat was out again. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and said she wanted to buy the car back. He said no. She offered $500,000. He said no. She said $1 million. He said no. She asked him why. He said, "Because you called it garbage." She looked at him. He looked back at her without hostility, without satisfaction, just a kind of steady clarity that she was unaccustomed to encountering. She said, "That was a mistake." He said, "A lot of things are mistakes. Some of them matter more than others." She started to say something else and then stopped because she had seen behind him on the kitchen table the composition notebook. She recognized it without knowing how she recognized it. She had never seen it before in her life, but she knew it immediately. In the way we sometimes know things we were never told through the accumulated weight of being someone's child. Her voice when she finally spoke was very quiet. "Where did you find that?" she said. He stepped aside. She walked into the apartment. She sat at the table. She looked at the cover for a moment before she opened it. Then she turned to the first page and read the name at the top. Her face did not change. She turned the page. She read slowly. Ethan made coffee he didn't drink and stood by the window and gave her the room. It took her 40 minutes to read the notebook. When she finished, she sat with her hands flat on the table on either side of it, and her breathing was very controlled in the specific way of someone controlling their breathing, because the alternative is not composure. She did not look up for a long time. When she did, her eyes were dry. "He wrote to me," she said, "in the margins, some of the margins near the end." Ethan hadn't seen that. He waited. She said, "He wrote," and then stopped. She closed the notebook. She said, "Never mind." She sat in his kitchen for a while longer, and then she stood and said goodnight and walked out of his apartment and down the stairs and into the cold. He watched from the window as she sat in her car for 10 minutes without starting the engine. Then she drove away. The days that followed were difficult. Someone, it was never conclusively established, who arranged for Ethan to be followed. A private investigator appeared in a car across the street from his building. A man he did not recognize began appearing near the garage where the restored car was being stored. Then the garage was vandalized. Not seriously, a broken lock, some tools displaced, nothing taken, because there was nothing small enough to take quickly, but the message was clear. Ethan brought Lily to stay with his sister in the suburbs for 3 days. He sat alone in his apartment and thought about quitting. He thought about it seriously, and specifically the way you think about something you are genuinely considering. Then Walter knocked and came in and sat down and told him what he knew about Raymond Sterling and the men who had stolen his patents and buried his name. Not the version that Ethan had pieced together from documents, but the version Walter knew firsthand. Because Walter had been young and working in the same industry in those years, and he had heard the stories, and some of them he had witnessed. When Walter finished, Ethan sat still for a while. Then he said, "This is about more than the money." Walter said, "It always was." Ethan said, "Then I'm not stopping." So the night before the auction, the car was gone. He went to the storage facility, and the car was not in its bay, and the facility manager could not explain it. Ethan stood in the empty space where it had been and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He called Walter. He called the auction house. He was on the phone with the police giving a statement in a voice that sounded calmer than he felt when Vivian appeared beside him. She had driven herself without a driver, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. She looked at the empty bay and said, "I didn't do this." He looked at her. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" He said, "Because you came here in person." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know who did." He said, "Then let's go." They drove through this worst of the winter storm together in her car, following a chain of information that Vivian had assembled from sources she did not explain in detail, moving through the night toward the container terminal on the south side of the port. The car was very warm inside, and the world outside was invisible beyond about 50 feet of headlights cutting through horizontal snow. Vivian drove with both hands on the wheel and her jaw set and her eyes on the road. Ethan navigated from his phone, following a map that kept losing signal and coming back. The wind came in off the lake in sheets, and the visibility was almost nothing. And they argued for most of the drive about her father, about the notebook, about what it meant to be born into someone else's failure and have to carry it forward. She said she had spent 20 years becoming the kind of person nothing could hurt. He said there was a name for that, and it wasn't strength. She told him he didn't know what he was talking about. He said maybe. They drove in silence for a while. She took a wrong turn and corrected without saying anything, and he didn't mention it. They passed through a stretch of empty industrial streets where the only light came from the car and from the orange glow of distant facility lights reflecting off the low clouds. Then she said, "He kept that notebook in the car." Ethan said yes. She said, "He spent the last 15 years of his life working in a factory. He never talked about the car. I thought he had let it go." Ethan said, the car was his whole story. All of it. The good part before it went wrong. She didn't answer. She was quiet for a long time, and the only sound was the storm and the wipers working hard against it. Then she said very quietly, as if she were saying it to herself rather than to him, "He wrote my name in the margins, near the end of the notebook. Just my name in the margins several times. I didn't tell you that." Ethan said nothing. She said, "I didn't understand when I was young why he spent all that time in the garage. I thought it meant something about me, that I wasn't—" She stopped. "Children are very literal," she said finally. "They see what they see and make the story that fits." The terminal appeared through the snow. They found the car in a container near the water. 3 men were working by flashlight, already removing the hood. Ethan moved before he had fully thought it through. The argument that followed was brief and loud, and ended when Vivian made a phone call that sent 3 different kinds of authority to the terminal in under 20 minutes. The men left. The car was intact. Ethan stood in the open container with the wind coming through, and his hands shaking slightly, and looked at the enamel crest on the nose of the car, still there, still red and silver, still the work of someone's careful hands. He crouched down and touched it. He thought about Lily saying her mother had sent them something. He thought about Raymond Sterling stamping his name into a valve cover in a machine shop in 1964, believing that the thing he was building would outlast everything else. He thought maybe the old man was right. The auction was held at the Harrington Grand Hotel, which felt appropriate in a way that Ethan did not mention to anyone. The ballroom was full. International collectors had flown in. There were people Ethan recognized from the automotive world, and people he didn't, dressed in the particular manner of people who measure their own importance in rooms like this and find themselves satisfied. Walter sat in the front row in the best suit Ethan had ever seen him wear, which still looked like a suit that had been through several meaningful occasions and remembered all of them. Lily was there in a blue dress with her hair done, her inhaler in her coat pocket, sitting very straight and watching everything with those dark, quick eyes. Vivian sat in the back of the room alone. When Ethan spoke, it was not what anyone expected. He was not a man accustomed to rooms like this, and he did not pretend to be. He stood at the front with the car behind him, fully restored. Now the bodywork redone, the chrome, polished the interior, reupholstered in correct period material, the engine rebuilt to factory specification, and then some, because Walter had decided that certain things deserved to be done perfectly, and he told the story the way he understood it. He did not have notes. He spoke in the plain, unhurried way of someone who knows the material because they lived inside it, rather than read about it. He talked about Raymond Sterling, who had been a brilliant man in a world that was not designed to reward brilliance without leverage. He talked about what it looks like when a man spends his gifts in a system that has no use for them, the slow erosion of it, the way a person can be excellent and still lose everything. Because excellence without power is just potential waiting to be taken. He talked about what the notebook contained, the drawings and the theories, and the small marginal notes that were sometimes technical and sometimes something else entirely. Something more like a conversation with a future that Raymond Sterling hoped would be kinder than his present. He talked about a man who hid his most important work in the base of a car seat and parked the car in a hotel garage, and maybe believed in the particular irrational way of people who still believe in things that the right person would eventually find it. He talked about the photograph of a little girl standing in the sun with her hand on a door handle. He did not mention Vivian by name. He didn't need to. The room was very quiet. He said, "Some things survive because someone refuses to let them disappear. I'm grateful I got to be the one who found this one." He stepped back. The auctioneer stepped forward. The bidding started at 1 million and moved quickly. By 3 million, the room had narrowed to 4 bidders. By 5, it was 2. One was a collector from Munich who had been searching for this car for 11 years, and whose composure Ethan noticed was beginning to show small fractures, a tightening around the jaw, a quality of stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. The other was a foundation representing a major automotive museum in Detroit that had long maintained an empty display case reserved for the missing crest prototype, a placeholder of faith that had outlasted the careers of 3 successive directors. The numbers climbed. 6 million. 7. The room had gone very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they understand they are witnessing something that will be talked about later. Ethan stood at the front and watched the numbers climb with a feeling he could not have named accurately, not triumph, not quite something quieter and more durable, like watching something set right that had been wrong for a very long time. When the hammer came down at $8 million, the room stood. He heard applause, as if it were happening in a different room. He looked for Lily and found her immediately because she was standing on her chair. He found Walter next, who was seated and not clapping, but simply nodding slowly, which was a more complete expression of everything than applause could have been. Then he looked toward the back of the room. Vivian Sterling was not applauding. She was not standing. She was sitting very still with her hands in her lap and her face turned slightly to one side, and her eyes bright and full in a way he had not seen before. She cried without sound the way people cry when they have had a great deal of practice not crying in front of anyone. She found him afterward in the corridor outside the ballroom. The noise from inside was still audible. She stood in front of him, and she said, "I have to tell you something." He waited. She said, "I thought he chose the car over us, over me. He was always working, always in the garage, always somewhere else. I thought we weren't enough for him." She stopped. She looked at the floor. "After reading the notebook, I understand that he was trying to leave something behind, something that meant he was here, that he had done something real. He didn't know how to explain that to a child." Ethan said nothing. She said, "I owe you an apology." He said, "You owe your father one. I'm fine." She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not the dissolution of the control she kept there, but a small reorganization of it, as if making room. She said, "What will you do with the money?" He said, "Take care of my daughter, open a restoration garage." She said, "I want to fund the garage." He started to say no out of reflex and then stopped because he recognized the reflex and examined it and decided it was pride rather than sense. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because my father's name should be on something that lasts, something real." He thought about it. He said, "Okay." Ethan used the money carefully and in order. The first thing he did before anything else, before he had even confirmed the transfer, was call the pharmacy. The prescription was filled. He picked it up in person and sat in his car in the parking lot and held the paper bag for a moment and breathed. Then he drove to his sister's house in the suburbs where Lily had been staying, and when she ran out to meet him in the driveway, he held on to her for a long time. She patted his back with the solemn competence of a child who has learned that sometimes adults need things they can't ask for directly. He said, "You're okay." She said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I mean, you're going to be okay. Your medicine." She pulled back and looked at him. "For how long?" she said. He said, "For a long time, for as long as you need it." She studied his face to make sure he meant it. Then she smiled, and the smile was so entirely her mother's smile that he had to look at the sky for a moment. She said, "Can we get the car fixed now?" He laughed. He said yes. Not in a single day, but gradually. The cold retreating by degrees, the snow becoming slush, and the slush becoming wet pavement, and the wet pavement drying in the pale light of an early March sun that felt after everything like something that had been earned. The garage opened in April. It was a proper space, bright and well-equipped, smelling of fresh paint and motor oil, and the particular honest combination of the two, with a two-post lift Ethan had spent 3 weeks researching, and a tool chest that Walter had declared adequate after an inspection that took longer than the purchase itself. The sign above the door read, "Sterling Restoration," in plain black letters on a white background, the kind of sign that tells you exactly what something is without needing to be impressive about it. On the day it opened, Walter arrived first before Ethan, and was sitting on a folding chair in the parking lot when Ethan pulled up in his car, his actual car, a 12-year-old sedan with a new battery and 2 new tires, which felt like an extravagance but was technically a business expense. Walter looked at the sign. He nodded. He said, "Raymond would have liked that name." Ethan said, "I know." They went inside. Walter came in every Tuesday and Thursday. He moved slowly, but he still moved, and he could look at a car and read it the way other people read books fluently, completely without effort. Lily visited on the weekends, and occasionally on school days that she argued with some validity were less important than learning to restore a 1962 Plymouth. Ethan would stand at the door of his new garage in the morning light and look at the photograph he had hung on the wall inside. Not the one of Vivian as a child that one was hers. Now he had given it back. But a photograph he had taken himself on the day of the auction of the '64 Crest prototype under the lights of the ballroom, polished and whole and seen. Vivian came by once in late March, unannounced. She drove herself again. No driver, no assistant, parking in the lot with the slight uncertainty of someone who is not accustomed to parking in lots that don't have attendants. She wore a coat he had not seen before, still expensive, still precise, but something about the way she wore it was different. Less armor, more clothing. She stood in the doorway of the garage and looked at the space, at the tools and the lift, and the half-dismantled 1958 Buick on the floor, at the framed photograph on the wall, at Walter, explaining something to Lily with his hands, while Lily nodded with that serious, particular nod she had. Vivian stood there and didn't say anything for a long time. Ethan came to stand beside her. She said, "He would have liked this." Ethan said, "I know." She looked at the photograph on the wall. She looked at the Buick. She looked at Lily, who had now apparently been entrusted with a ratchet and was using it with the focused concentration of someone being trusted with something important. Walter said something that made Lily laugh, and the laugh filled the garage and went up into the high ceiling and came back down, and Vivian stood in the doorway with her hands in her coat pockets and listened to it. She smiled. It was small, and it cost something, and it was real. Ethan thought that the most valuable things often are the ones that cost something to give, that don't arrive without effort or loss or the long, slow work of changing what you thought was fixed about yourself. He thought about a car buried under dust and time in a dark garage, waiting for someone who knew how to look at something and see what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be. He thought about Lily saying her mother had sent them a gift. He looked at the sign above the door of the garage. He thought that maybe the 8-year-old was right. There are things in this world that people call worthless. They call them worthless quickly and without much examination, because the world moves fast and looking carefully at things takes time that most people have decided they cannot afford. They call things worthless because the value is buried, because the surface is damaged, because the story attached to the thing makes them uncomfortable in ways they haven't learned to sit with. And sometimes, a thing that has been called worthless finds its way to someone who has been called that too at some point in some room by someone who didn't look carefully enough. And when that happens, something remarkable is occasionally possible. Not always, not easily, but possible. Some things are called worthless only because the people calling them that have never understood what lives inside them.